have planned to share a PowerPoint, and I want to have time at the end. So I'm just gonna um, weave into the talk on the middle way toward body liberation, and I'll have slides, and I'll be reading them all verbatim, so you don't even have to look at the screen while you're doing things. And it's I've put a lot of heart into the words I'll be sharing, and so and you take what you need, and leave the rest. And so I'm gonna go with the flow and talk about the middle way to body liberation. And the middle way is a term that comes from the Noble Eightfold Path. Yeah, that for many of you, that it is said that it was the Buddha's first teaching after experiencing awakening, and so that the Buddha gave this path to ending suffering. And there's a picture here. A lot of monasteries in Buddhist countries have on top of them a statue of an 8-spoke wheel, and each of these 8 spokes are the Eightfold Path, and so it's called the Dhamma Chakra, the wheel of the Dharma. And in this particular picture, there's 2 deer flanking the statue, because it was said that the Buddha gave the first sermon in Deer Park, and so there's other interpretations, but that's basically what I have come to understand. And the Four Noble Truths, and so each of these can be a whole talk unto themselves, and but most of you are familiar, and I think it's such good reminders. This first noble truth of unsatisfactoriness or suffering, or that it's a part of life, stress or even trauma, that's a part of living this human existence. And the second noble truth, one of the translations is arising, so that we notice in our own interpersonal experience or in the world that suffering arises, and then we forget that it is a part of life, and we do all these things to try to avoid it from arising, or to deny it or push it away, or hold on to things because we think they're going to bring us everlasting happiness. And so we come to a sense of noticing that there's a rising, and when we notice that, that's like the third noble truth, that there's a cessation, there's like a pause, there's a moment of awakening where it's like, oh wow, like that I'm not wrong for like not wanting to suffer. And in that opening, or in that pause, in that sense of like that it's not entirely personal, or that I've done something wrong, that there's a cessation, there's like an ending of suffering in that moment. And so the fourth noble truth is that we practice, we continue practicing. And I love the teaching, so I'm going to go through and relate it to this term, diet culture. And so the Eightfold Path, wise view and intention and speech and action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, I'll be breaking down. And so I want to use this frame of a system of oppression called diet culture. And it's a belief system that I've been really deep diving into, and it's provided this like theoretical framework to realize how much suffering and obsession and disordered relationship I've had with the earth ultimately, and food specifically. And Christy Harrison is a person that has a podcast called Food Psych, PSYCH, and she talks about these 4 aspects of this system of diet culture, and worshiping thinness and equating that to moral virtue. So thinking that because we are maybe in larger bodies or having like any sense of not fitting. And you all know where this is going, right? This has complete like racist and sexist roots. Yeah. That somehow we're like broken if we're not thin. Yeah. The second point here is promoting weight loss to achieve higher status. Yeah. So we end up spending so much time, energy, money trying to shrink our bodies when that's really not possible for most people. Yeah. And because and so it demonizes certain ways of eating. So I've gotten rid of the word healthy um, because that's one of the ways that it's subtle, but that we moralize food, that certain food is unhealthy or bad or junk. And then there's food that's like morally, higher status. And then so we could start to see how some of these things go along, creating socioeconomic oppression. Like we start to blame people for not enjoying their food, right? And so and so the fourth point here is around oppressing us, folks of color, women, femme folks with disabilities, and how it's really damaging for our health. And so wise view, so an understanding that joy and suffering are intertwined. Yeah. And so how has diet culture taught us to be dissatisfied with our bodies? And how does that manifest as dukkha? Yeah. So dukkha was that first noble truth, right? So dissatisfied with our bodies. Yeah. And how does that create more suffering when there's inevitably going to be suffering in our bodies? We're subject to illness and age and death. Yeah. And so how does it amplify dukkha? And how have we been trained to ignore our inner guidance that naturally seeks a middle way? I think of I've worked with a lot of babies and seeing how a lot of anxiety gets projected, or just to speak to my experience of like growing up with food scarcity. Yeah. So having my family come from El Salvador and not have much monetary wealth, and that scarcity of like not maybe having enough food, and how that gets put on to us. Yeah. And when kids naturally are picky and kind of sense, they have this intuitive eating that they sense what is good, what is needed, and how we receive nourishment and in other ways. And so there's a quote here by Christy Harrison that we can't permanently change our body size through food intake and exercise the way we've been told we can. And the same is true of our health, which is, of course, not dependent on our body size. So that's deep, because we're taught that when you're sick, that it's your fault and that you're doing something wrong. Yeah. And that you're not doing enough of this or doing too much of that. And so wise view is a reminder that joy and suffering are intertwined, and dukkha is a part of life. Yeah. And then wise intention is generally the second spoke. And so resolving to practice non-harm. So how can we practice honoring the signals from our bodies to reduce harm? I so many times, if I'm stuck on devices or I'm feeling hunger, like I've equated that with like, I shouldn't be hungry, or it's not the right time, or let me just hold off, or I'm bad for like for having like a body and feeling signals from it, and so and then so who taught us that certain food is harmful, right? So here's a quote from Audre Lorde. She, in Sister Outsider, she said, "The true focus of revolutionary change is never merely the oppressive situations that we seek to escape, but that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within us. And so I'm just giving us an overview, and each slide, as you see, has 2 questions and then a quote. And so these, just to notice what's arising in your body and your mind, and of course, there's no wrong. Why speech? So practicing, and there's an acronym THINK. Yeah, timely, honest, inspiring, necessary, and kind. So what specific ways have we been taught and have internalized derisive and abusive speech about food and our bodies? And so that's this term of fat phobia. And there's a wonderful, intense and academic book by an awesome person named Sabrina Strings. She's a sociologist. And so she has a book called Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia. And so this really breaks down how we have been taught that our bodies are wrong, and so how can we practice wise speech, that internalized speech, and to know, like, wow, these are very deliberate ways we've been taught to not appreciate our bodies as they are. And then, as you know, we've learned them in our families too. Yeah, and because, like, my family, again, like, coming to this country and not meeting these standards that are impossible, and just how much gets projected and targeted, and how that's passed on. Yeah. So what are the practices that can help us communicate about food and bodies in loving ways? So yeah, we did some of that in the beginning, and yeah, and because how much stress goes into, like, I'm eating and it's like, oh, I'm already eating too much, or I'm like thinking of something else, or I'm not slowing down enough to appreciate, like I'm feeling guilty or something. But how can I communicate? I know one practice for me is that my prayer is that may all beings be fed and nourished, like every time I eat, and that helps open my heart to nourishment. Yeah, and wishing that for all beings. The Buddha in the Ekadama Sutta said, "I don't envision a single thing that, when unguarded, leads to such great harm as the mind. The mind, when unguarded, leads to great harm." Yeah, so that was the invitation in the meditation, is to notice the mind, and it's not just the thoughts, right? It's the whole experience, how we experience the world, yeah, through our senses. And I mean, another thing is, yeah, like sometimes just I always I eat with my hands, and like, so who taught us that that's not okay, So wise action, refraining from killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct. And how do we reckon with the reality that most of our food systems are violent? Yeah. That many beings, including humans and the earth as a whole, are brutally exploited in order to bring us food. And that's heavy, yeah. And how have I, like, made food choices in ways that doesn't, like, that takes on this responsibility on this kind of individual level when it's a systemic design, yeah. And how I've gotten into, I'll call it saviorism, right? That, oh, if I control my food in certain ways, then I am relieved of the complicity in the system. And how have we been taught that taking pleasure in food and in our bodies is wrong? So how have we been taught that taking pleasure in our food and in our bodies is wrong? Adrienne Marie Brown, I touch my own skin, and it tells me that before there was any harm, there was miracle. Wise livelihood, working toward a society where all beings are materially and spiritually nourished. It's another Big question, is it possible to make an ethically sound living in late-stage capitalism? And how do we practice wise action when seeking to sustain ourselves and our communities? So, Rabindranath Tagore, I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and saw that life was service. I acted and behold, service was joy. So how do we make it our job to enjoy our bodies and enjoy, taking pleasure and giving pleasure? Knowing service, true service, is that there isn't a separation between you and me and the earth and all the beings, across time, generations, forward and in the past. So the sixth fold on the path, wise effort. So endeavoring to cultivate skillful thoughts, words, and deeds, and letting go of unskillful habits. So an unskillful habit for me around food is a term I learned a couple years ago called orthorexia, ORTHOXIA, orthorexia. And maybe I missed a couple letters there, but that is this obsession with like, quote unquote, clean eating. And that term is so activating to me because as a person of color and non-white person, the sense of dirty, like dirty eating, is something that I'm working on every day. It's like to feel not dirty for not being a person, a white-bodied person. So how we internalize diet culture rules, which both reward and punish us for how we eat and look. Where do we strive too much to be perfect about eating and our bodies? So I'm bringing this to you because it's like every day, and it's lesson and it's dukkha, and I notice it, and it's not in the subconscious, and it's not running the show anymore. But how many times have I like forced my body to like make up for eating too much, and hurt my body with over exercising, and I don't even like the word exercise. Cancel that one too. I like saying moving my body joyfully. So where is this middle path of effort? Of knowing, believing, having faith in that our bodies are perfect just as they are, and that we don't have to do anything, right? That we can, when we're practicing being, that is healing. That is what aligns us with what with clear seeing. So this quote by Prentice Hemphill: perfectionism is a commitment to habitual self-doubt. So it's like I'm all these habits of like striving to be something fucking else than I fucking am, right? Just do. It's like once I get there, then I'll, and this and that. And it's like, fuck that shit, right? Perfectionism is a commitment to saying I'm not good enough, right? Wise mindfulness, being aware of bodies, feelings, thoughts, and mental qualities. Can we interrupt when bodies are being criticized by the unrealistic and racist beauty standards that are the foundation of diet culture, right? So as we start to open up and start to hang out with people, I have I'm in a bigger body than I was pre-pandemonium, and and how do we interrupt people saying like, oh, you look good, or like commenting on people's weight, right? And so So a couple things. So obsessing about our food is like the worst thing for our health. And again, fat does not mean unhealthy. Yeah. And what's the most unhealthy thing is weight stigma. Just this term weight stigma, how the systems, the medical system, the wellness industrial complex, how all the criticism folks in larger bodies get is actually the worst thing for our health. Yeah. And if we are not the victim, we're perpetrating that. So underneath that perpetration is, I'm not good enough, right? So how can we bring awareness to when we are kind of side-eyeing or like having a look on our faces? And then how do we do that in the mirror too? How do we honor our experience and find wholesome ways to comfort and nourish as to heal the causes of suffering? So as I mentioned in the meditation, energy, joy, and gratitude, generosity, these are all the factors of enlightenment. Like we actually need joy and energy to be in the moment, yeah, and to sustain us on this path. So Lama Rod, I love this definition of mindfulness, training the mind to return to the present moment over and over again. And again, the mind is all our senses, right? With a sense of non-judgmental awareness and kindness, guided by this intention to reduce harm for ourselves and others. So we're bringing mindfulness so that we can be aware of how we've internalized these messages. So the last spoke on the wheel is wise concentration, bringing together all the rest of the Eightfold Path in order to experience clearly, to see clearly the obstacles, the obstacles as part of the path, right, to serenity, to insight. So what meditation practices help you generate and connect to peace and understanding? And it's not just sitting, folks. You all know that, right? It's one way. But so what practices help us generate, connect to peace, understanding? And what does freedom from the relentless messaging of diet culture look like, taste like, feel like? Sonia Renee Taylor. As we awaken to our indoctrinated body shame, we feel inspired to awaken others and to interrupt the systems that perpetuate body shame. And Sonia Renee Taylor calls it like body terrorism, and oppression against all bodies. So we start with ourselves, and and we bring kindness and we bring awareness to where there isn't kindness. So I am stopping there for a moment, and I'll invite you to check in with your body. Sometimes I tell myself, what's the next thing I got to do to take care of myself? So I encourage you to give yourself permission, give your body permission to take care of itself. Is there a way that you want to bring touch to your body, move, or you're all on mute, you can scream? I want to, yeah. And the screaming is this anger of like, how, or a grief of like, all the times I didn't enjoy food, and we all grew up with rules around food, and one of the food rules was like, for me, was like, finish everything on your plate. So it was both like appreciate the food you have, but then coming again from this like scarcity. And yeah, I'm just curious, like, just to think about like what food rules we have, right? Something that pops in my head because it was in high school in the 90s, and I watched that Clueless movie with Alicia Silverstone, and there was a scene where they were cutting a bagel, and they were like, "Oh, if you cut it this way, you actually lose weight because if you're eating small pieces, you know." But and so I'm just being ridiculous. But like how many rules we have been placed on us to, um, take away pleasure. Um, yeah. Thanks, Julio. Yeah. Um, when my grandma, she was an amazing cook. And so when I would go to the dishes, and I still bring these practices, but I've updated them to make sense for my life. And my grandma would make me say, gracias in Spanish, gracias a Dios que ya comí. So thanks to God that I have now eaten, as I place the dishes in there. And in the sink. And so for most of us, the dishwashing is an unpleasant task. Yeah. So now I still say that I just appreciate um, the plate. And then as I'm washing the plate with the water, I'm appreciating the water and thanking the water, and practicing surrender, and feeling the water, and blessing it to wherever it goes next. And then there's this wave of like feeling the water on my skin and in my body. And so I'm connecting as a way to do something with the scarcity or the reality of drought here in the state of California. And so it becomes, so I've, yeah, I made the practice mutable. Is that the word? That's the word that's coming, but made the practice make sense for myself. And that's definitely the encouragement for each of us to find ways to, because again, coming back to the wise view is like there is suffering, and I often find myself thinking, oh, there is a like pure like time in the past when there wasn't any suffering, or it's just my family story, and if I just clean it up, or like eat right, or look a certain way, then it'll somehow like make me all white, like. And so like, so watching that internalized messaging is like really uncomfortable, and also freeing. Let's dedicate the merit. And just wishing that the merits that we've generated, so the wisdom that we got in touch with, that's already in us, that is made clearer when we come into spiritual community. So may that nourish us for the rest of our lives. May we remember this wisdom of the miracle that is our bodies, even if we've been lied to. May we appreciate ourselves just as we are. May we continue to have the inner outer resources to nourish, feed ourselves. And may all beings be nourished, fed, liberated. Much appreciation, y'all. Thank you for coming together. And yes, give good care. And until next time, thank you for your practice.